Right now, the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore is telling the story of African American experiences and contributions to the railroad industry. Here to tell us more about it is the B&O Railroad Museum Executive Director, Chris Holland. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having us.
How important is it to have this story told in the B&O Railroad Museum?
It's very important because, we have always focused on collecting trains, and we have amassed an amazing collection, but now we are really focusing on what are the stories behind the train. What are the social, cultural, economic impacts, that the railroad brought, and to who. And the railroad would not be here today but for African Americans and their contributions. So we want to tell that story.
And what can people find when they get on this railroad tour? What can they learn?
What can they learn? Well, there's a number of things. One, I think most people do not realize that the railroads, particularly the southern railroads, were constructed, those railroads were built by enslaved people. And most people, the railroads were not actually slave owners, but they did lease slaves. And I think that's part of history people don't realize. And so you can see that on our tour. We talk about it. We talk about how also freed and escaped African American slaves at that point in time also helped the Union beat the South by helping to sabotage some of the railroads and then reconstruct the railroads later. We also talk about the Jim Crow era and the segregation era, and we actually take people into an actual combine car. And then we conclude with talking about civil rights and showing, and we can talk more detail about this, but showing an actual Pullman car, a Pullman sleeper car.
And tell us more about the Pullman Porter.
So the Pullman Porter, the sleeper cars were really important. The Pullman Company was very important because they, from around the 1860s to the 1920s, the Pullman Company was actually the largest employer of African Americans in the country. And these jobs were considered to be, really well-respected positions, plum positions. They had a decent salary for that time. And you could become a Pullman porter, but it was hard work. And there was discrimination part of it. For example, George Pullman was the owner of the company, and any porter or porterette that worked on the Pullman cars was called George. So, but later, but it did provide a pathway to the middle class, and that, these were respectable jobs. But later, it also was an opportunity for African Americans. They formed the Pullman Porters Union. And through that union, we're able to get better wages, to, decrease the amount of hours worked per week. And that led into the civil rights era.
And what did a Pullman Porter do?
A Pullman porter's job was exceedingly hard. I mean, when you come in and see the Pullman porter car, you will see sleeping berths. And so the Pullman porter had to take care of everything. They made up the berths in the morning, they took them down at night, they serviced the passengers because the B&O, which would have Pullman cars on it, was known for exceptional service. So anything a person may want, the Pullman porter took care of.
And for this tour, you also talk about, and we talked about a little bit, the Jim Crow era.
Yes.
So what can people see? I know you were talking about a car that people could actually see.
So they can walk into the car and they can see, it's a combine car where they can see the part of the car that was white only, and then they can see where African Americans were allowed to sit. And there is a there is a difference in the seating. And something that people may not realize is that during that Jim Crow era, you would have states that were segregated states and states that did not support segregation. So if you bought a ticket on the train, and that train went through D.C., which was not a segregated area, but crossed over into Virginia, for example, which was, you had to change your seat. And if you didn't change your seat, you're going to be thrown off. Mm-hmm. And there was a woman who, Kate Brown, we actually tell the story in the car, she refused, it's kind of pre-Rosa Parks, she refused to get out of her seat. And she was thrown, onto the platform, a very common practice. She was injured, because you can imagine being thrown off, and she sued. She actually won. She didn't get nearly what she should have been compensated, but the fact that she won was, instrumental.
And these are extremely important stories to our history, extremely important. And can you tell me just what do people find is the most engaging thing in part of this tour? Like, what do people say, wow, I never knew this, never understood this until now?
I think the fact that there is such a complex, interconnected history on the whole journey. And I think two other elements. I think people do not realize that, as I said, that the railroads were built with slave labor. And then I think the part people probably enjoy the most is going into a Pullman car and seeing, I mean, and our Pullman car looks just as if the people had just gotten up and left.
Wow. Wow. And how much does it cost to be part of this tour?
So the tour is complimentary with admission.
Wonderful. How much is admission?
So admission is $20, and the tour is at scheduled times. And so I would check our website, and we would love to have everybody join.
And I understand that you guys are working to make this a permanent part?
We are, because we think it is such an important part of history that we are working to make this something that is offered on a routine basis.
Wonderful. How many people actually use this tour or the different tours that are available through the B&O Railroad Museum?
So we have a large number of visitors each year, and one of the things we're planning to do with this tour as well is to make it available to school children. We are refining it a little bit so that it's available and appropriate for all ages, but that will be coming very soon.
And how can people get to the B&O Railroad Museum using MTA?
Using MTA, it's very easy. They can take the number 76 or the Navy line and walk right there. And also, while we encourage people to take transit, we also do have a big, free, accessible parking lot.
And how can people find more information on not just this tour, but all the tours that are available through the B&O Railroad Museum?
Everything is on our website, borail.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.